In this video, we'll review the method of community field research. We can begin by noting that the field of community sociology started exclusively by relying on this method of field research. And all the classic studies of early times, such as Middletown by Lind and Lind, research by the Chicago School by Robert Park and colleagues, or Yankee City by Warner, all of these relied on field research methods. We can find more recent examples of community field research in the work of Gans, in terms of the West End of Boston, or Kornblum's Blue Collar Community, or Horowitz's Honor in the American Dream, all of these building off of the examples set by the classic studies. And even more recent examples of this method are Elijah Anderson's Streetwise and Mitchell Dunier's Slim's Table. And each of these field research projects provides a way of thinking about race and offering contrasting views, right, that incorporate theoretical frames. So these are qualitative research projects, typically not relying on statistical analysis as we do with indicators or survey research. So in general, community field research involves a variety of different methods. And as mentioned, most of these are qualitative methods, and that involves some kind of direct observation, either as being a participant or a complete observer. Apart from that, in-depth interviews, focus groups, or visual methods can be used. And actually, visual methods and focus groups can have quantitative components to them. But typically, direct observation and in-depth interviews are exclusively qualitative, and that just means they only generate text as the form of data instead of numbers. So at times, we'll combine field research with a survey or with an analysis of community indicators to get a kind of triangulation going, and that is always a desirable sort of approach if it's possible. So if we think about participant observation, this is most closely aligned with the notion of field research, because in order to do it, one has to go into the field, and that means they have to find a way to gain entry. They need to, not always, but most of the time, they're participating in that field in some capacity, whether they're just living in the community or working in the community, getting first-hand experiences and access to other people participating. So there are a variety, though, of roles that a researcher can take, and one of the key questions is whether or not you're going to be out in the open, that you are a researcher, taking notes and planning to cobble those notes together into some kind of analysis and research report. And a lot of times it's in the interest of everybody to keep those things a secret, such as when you're doing field research on illegal activity or groups that are engaged in illegal activity. But another question is whether or not you're going to be involved as a participant, and that's always a big question in gang research, for instance, where participation means that the researcher themselves may be implicated in violence or drug activity or any of the things that gangs are involved in. And of course, the advantage is the only way to really gain insider access is to become a participant, but it does carry a great deal of risk, and a lot of researchers aren't willing to assume that level of risk, so they'd rather be a complete observer and would more likely rely on methods like in-depth interviews if that were the case. So the level of immersion is an important point to consider. Living in a community, because we're talking about field research in the context of community sociology. By living in a community, you get a better idea about how things work, who's got the best and biggest reputations, how decisions are made, how the economy runs, what kind of shape the environment's in, the infrastructure. And you can think about all the capitals of the community capitals framework, and as a participant, you'll get a sense of things without ever actually going out and interviewing people, although certainly you'll want to interview people. But the more you participate, the less reliant you are on informants, and conversely, the less you participate, the more reliant you are on informants. And if you're totally just observing, you're not participating, you're completely reliant on key informants for your information. And the downside of that is key informants serve as gatekeepers. They get to control the flow of information. They decide what you know, and they keep from you things they don't want you to know, and those can be severe limitations. So in the context of community field research, not everything's quite as dangerous or exotic as studying gangs or something like that. We're not always dealing with illicit activities and that kind of thing. These are just special examples. But just by participating in volunteer organizations, for instance, one can gain a lot of understanding about poverty, for instance, if you work at a soup kitchen. So that's one way to gain access. And participating in community events, maybe a community will host a free lunch program where free lunches are offered in a local park, and residents of the community can come and have a free meal. And that would also provide one way of studying socioeconomic conditions and poverty. The key, though, is to take a lot of notes. Whether or not you're just observing or participating doesn't matter. Good field research depends on the quality of your notes and the extensiveness of your notes. And that can be a stream of consciousness. It can be something more careful. But we want to get everything down as quickly as we can and as soon as we can, because the less you write down, the more you're going to forget. And that's an important thing. And it's also important to jot notes about how you're reacting to things. We call those reflexive notes. So we're not just, recording what we're observing, but we're also making notes about how we process that ourselves. Because when you do this kind of research, you are the research instrument, and your emotions come into play and can have an impact on how you interpret things. Visual methods are great if we're doing something like interviews or community surveys where you show the respondent some kind of image. Maybe it's a picture of a dilapidated building or something like that, and then you ask them to just talk about what they see. So photo elicitation is what we're talking about, and it's based on the idea that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So if the person you're interviewing recognizes the building, they may already have some kind of opinion and a set of values they'll share with you. And all of this is going to be qualitative and open-ended. So that's what puts it in this category of community field research as opposed to community surveys. But we could also think of ways to structure closed-ended questions and modify visual methods to become a more quantitative survey-based methodology. With in-depth interviews, the goal is to have some kind of a conversation with someone, but it's a conversation with purpose. You want to, as the person doing the interview, you want to allow the conversation to be sort of natural. You don't want to come off as somebody who's conducting a survey questionnaire, for instance. That is a different method and a different kind of conversation. And it's a very unnatural conversation. And people are going to be more forthcoming if you have a good rapport with them, and rapport and trust go hand in hand. Ideally, you can record the conversation because, trying to jot everything down with a pen is going to make for an unnatural conversation, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So if you have a tape recorder or digital recorder and the person consents to being recorded, then you can capture everything, and then once it's all captured, you can transcribe it, and then those transcribed notes are your data. But two things we need to think about: who is being interviewed, and are we talking to a gatekeeper, somebody who's a key informant? We already mentioned some of the downsides of that. Or somebody who's a window into a hidden social world. In fact, sometimes we want to study subgroups like the Latino homeless population of a rural community. Well, it may be very hard to find members of that community or that subgroup. So if you find someone, they're giving you a window that's rare and unusual, and it's quite valuable to have that interview. Focus groups are generally qualitative. Yes, you could administer group-based community surveys, but that's not really what we're talking about here. When you bring people together, it's like a series of in-depth interviews happening at the same time. And one of the advantages of this particular method, as opposed to just interviewing people one-on-one, is that when the group members hear each other talk, it can sometimes evoke ideas in one another. And you, as the interviewer, can sort of sit back and just allow it to unfold, as serving more as a facilitator than as somebody who's raising and probing with questions all the time. And once again, the same principles hold. If you can record and transcribe the conversations, then you're going to have the richest level of qualitative data to work with. And the key question then is who gets to go into the focus group. And you want to be strategic there, and typically sampling is not based on randomness or trying to create a representative group, as that usually requires a large sample, and that's really not feasible when we're doing qualitative research. So we want to be strategic. We want to use purposive sampling. It's a non-probability sample. It's not generalizable, but the people you're interviewing have some kind of special knowledge that you're trying to access. So in the end, what do we gain from community field research? And as we saw from the very beginning of community sociology, this method was dominant, and the product was some kind of holistic understanding of the community under investigation. And sometimes you can take these particularistic analyses and make generalizations, even if that's not the goal. But typically, when we're trying to generate theoretical ideas about how things work, there's nothing like field research. It's an exploratory method. It opens windows that we didn't know were closed. So if we're studying things like power dynamics or mechanisms of social control, we're in a good place. But we're not going to be able to test theories. We might be able to generate them, but typically theory testing is a quantitative endeavor, and that will lead us towards either community indicators or community survey research. So each of the methods we're looking at for studying communities has its own purpose and its own set of advantages and disadvantages. But one of the key things is, if you're going to do one of these classic style community field research projects, is being careful about which community you pick. You don't want to just pick something because it's convenient. We typically choose case studies because they allow us to explore some kind of idea, right? There's something unique about it. As opposed to just being a typical community, we want to study the highly unusual communities because that's the real advantage of qualitative methods. Stylistically, case studies provide enduring profiles of communities, and they could be used in evaluation research. Maybe not to measure progress as much as simply to gain a qualitative understanding of how things work in the community, which can inform our theoretical understanding. And we'll connect some of that stuff to theory later. But a limitation of community case studies is they're generally very inward-looking. That is to say, they tend to treat the community as if it's an island. At least that was the case with the early classic community studies, and I think that's a critique that is now considered a little more carefully in contemporary case study work. But we want to make sure we're noting how the community is tied into the wider region, the nation, and of course the world.